Today, I'm going to interview Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Cutright, and we're going to talk about military ethics. All right, Kevin, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey, Kevin Cutright. You're looking at a guy in civilian clothes, but believe it or not, I'm an Army officer. I'm on the faculty at West Point, the United States Military Academy, and I'm in this dream gig where I get to be an Army officer and a college professor. So I'm a lieutenant colonel in the Army. The Army sent me to graduate school, which is where I met Jason. And now, for the last 5 years, I've been teaching cadets philosophy, ethics, specifically military ethics, at the U.S. Military Academy.
All right, wonderful. Why don't you tell us the title of your book and then give us a summary of the book?
Yeah, the book is called The Empathetic Soldier. I was purposely trying to combine two things that we don't often think about together: empathy and soldiers. In the end, the book is an argument that empathy is a good thing for soldiers to have. And for many of you, it might be surprising to know that what started me on this journey was the fact that empathy is in Army Doctrine. So if you looked up the Army Manual on Leadership, it explains how empathy is an important trait for every soldier and leader to have. And even more controversially, it says empathy is something that needs to be exercised not only with subordinates, not only with civilians or local populations of wherever the Army might go and serve, but even with enemy combatants. And so that's really what triggered, my own interest in this is how do we reconcile empathy with some of the duties that soldiers have, especially, of course, the duty at times to kill. So that was actually a decade ago, and 3 years, or pardon me, 1 year ago, published this book called The Empathetic Soldier. So in the book, I basically tackle two confusions. I spend an early chapter trying to canvas the various theories about empathy in order to nail down what are we actually talking about. And then I spend two later chapters wrestling with what the real purpose of a soldier is. And once we get both those things clarified sufficiently well, I point out how I think in the end I can show how empathy is compatible with soldierly duties. One last opening comment I'll make is along the way, I take up a concern of whether soldiers who are empathetic become more vulnerable to moral injury, which is similar to PTSD, but instead of being very fear-based and the reliving of a traumatic event and the fear that goes along with that, moral injury is this it's a very guilt-based psychic wound, if you will, where they exhibit a lot of the same symptoms of PTSD, but along with it comes maybe some self-condemnation or self-hatred, a lot of anger, often again self-directed, and it has proven to be a problem among some veterans. Moral injury is not unique to military veterans, but it's where it's maybe gotten some of the most study.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, it's definitely like I definitely don't have the impression that the military is an empathetic organization. I think I
Yeah,
guess civilians have the impression that it's like a tough guy club. You get these big macho men with their big guns and they shoot people, right?
right, right.
So if you're saying that empathy is actually part of the military ethos, like how does that actually play out in their training? Like is it somehow rewarded or anything or what?
Yeah. So I actually write the book partly with my own peers as the intended audience, where I don't think empathy is fully embraced and engaged within the military culture. So to your point, right? Not even many of us in uniform conceive of soldiering as an empathetic endeavor. So, what I try to lay out is, in fact, how it can and should be. Now, to another part of your question, though, our most senior leaders have endorsed it as important, not only in the doctrine that I mentioned already, but even in our evaluation reports. So we'll get these at least annual evaluations on our performance, and empathy is an explicit question that the supervisor has to answer on whether the subordinate is being properly empathetic. Now, here again, I do think that there are several within Army circles and the other military services where empathy either is misunderstood or they don't see how it's compatible. And so I think it varies a lot in terms of how much it's enforced or how much it's expected. But the truth is, it's endorsed from the highest levels and baked into our evaluation system. and our description maybe of what the ideal is that we ought to be seeking.
Okay. So I guess it might be useful to take a step back and just ask what you mean when you say empathy. Like, is it just understanding the other person?
Yeah, it is a form of understanding. More specifically, it's an experiential understanding of what another person is feeling or thinking. So, like grasping to some extent the experience that another person is having. And so, in this regard, it goes beyond like a theoretical understanding that, hey, Jason Chen is happy, and I can just put this label on him in a kind of a, if I can use some philosophy like terms, right? A propositional claim that Jason Chen is happy. Empathy, or an empathetic understanding of Jason Chen being happy, would be actually understanding what it means to feel happy, or how he's feeling happy because he's thinking of these things or experiencing this. So empathy, an empathetic understanding of another, specifically a grasp of their experience. I should highlight quickly, it doesn't mean agreement with the other person's experience or judgments or feelings. And so in this regard, it is an understanding of the other, not agreement with the other. One other distinction becomes really important to make as you look at the research is empathy is different than sympathy. And this seems to get talked about enough. I'm happy to explore it further, but the idea that empathy is different than sympathy, in that it's not necessarily caring for another. It again is simply understanding that other and the experience they're having.
Interesting. Okay. It's not necessarily caring, just understanding the experience that they're having. So how would that affect one's behavior on the battlefield?
Yeah, so it can affect one's behavior in both epistemological ways, in terms of how well we understand and are taking in input, and moral ways, right? The informing the moral judgments that we might make on a battlefield. So on the epistemological side, to the extent that you can empathetically, and I'll focus here on enemy combatants, just because that seems the hardest thing to grasp. But there's ways in which this applies to any human actors, right? In the context we're talking about. But to the extent you might empathetically understand your enemy, you're better able to understand how they're experiencing either the battle in particular, or if you take a step back from the front line, you're better understanding how they see the world and how they see this war and this battle. And you're better understanding maybe what motivates them versus what doesn't motivate them. Might even have a better understanding of what to expect from them. Because if you understand their experience, and you combine this maybe with some kind of understanding or homework that's been done about their level of training or their background, you can better anticipate how they might behave on that battlefield. You might be able to more precisely understand that, hey, if we conduct a certain kind of tactic, it's going to scare them in a way that maybe a more fully trained element, would not be scared. So to me, this is all the epistemological side, right? It's this way of being able to better anticipate what an enemy is going to do, or at least understand how they're going to react to things, or experience things that either you do or that maybe are other factors in the context. Now, on the moral side, empathetically understanding that enemy combatant comes down to basically maintaining a grasp of their humanity and how they remain human, even if they are on the other side of a weapon system that they're pointing at you. And so empathy can help bolster the kind of moral restraint that we expect of soldiers. As much as we might, there's no denying that soldierly duties require the killing of others at times. Empathetically considering them ensures that those times are truly warranted times and not excessive times. Also, once that enemy combatant maybe ceases to be a combatant and in fact has entered a different status because maybe they've surrendered or they've been wounded, an empathetic grasp of that enemy helps better ensure that the way they get treated as a prisoner or the way that they receive medical aid from you and your unit is more reliable.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So in regards to the epistemological aspect, it sounds like knowing your enemy, right? Like you will benefit in your war efforts if you know and understand your enemy. If you do this, they're going to think this, or they're going to react in this way. So it's kind
Right.
of almost like a social intelligence,
Yes. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
maybe just like on a larger scale. I don't know.
No, you're right. And in the emotional intelligence literature I've looked at, right, empathy is often one component of a number of other things that'll get cashed out under the general umbrella of EI. But yes, I think that's absolutely right. This gets into both the epistemological and the moral, but dehumanization. I mean, I think what immediately comes to our minds would be the moral aspect of that, right? And I've kind of already talked about that, right? That empathetically understanding the enemy combatant keeps them human, right? So it preempts the kind of dehumanizing that can maybe so easily occur with all the emotions and all the extremes of war. But there's even an epistemological element to this as well. There's some interesting literature that talks about not this kind of visceral dehumanization of others in a really kind of hot hatred sense, and maybe demeaning them as insects or evil incarnate, but more of this bland dehumanization of objectifying that enemy, where it's not that you hate them, you're just treating them as a dot on a radar screen, or you're referring to them as any number of the terms that actually are somewhat common, maybe across military doctrine and conduct of targets, or sorry, I'm spacing now, but field artillery officer that I've been over the years, right, will sometimes fall into the trap of just referring to them as objects instead of as humans. And this bland dehumanization, there's a couple of voices out there, and I could share the literature as desired, who actually argue that this bland dehumanization is the right way to go. It's the only way to allow a soldier to do what they need to do and still reconcile that with their own humanity or something. In my book, I actually disagree. I think any kind of dehumanization is actually mistaken. If nothing else, at a very fundamental level of the epistemology, they're not less than human, right? They are fully human. So let's allow that to just play into our navigating of the battlefield. And so, yeah, I don't want to drone on too long, but you got two kinds of dehumanization out there, and even the bland kind, I think, is an inappropriate one to attempt, even if it does maybe in the moment make things easier. Sometimes these soldiers will often get haunted by it later, and all the better just to own the humanity of all involved from the get-go.
Yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying. Can you remind me what field artillery means?
Oh yeah, sorry. Field artillery would be that branch of the Army that has these really big cannons and howitzers and rockets that are firing many miles, away. So in my 27 years in the Army, the first half especially was very focused on these field artillery units that I was in.
Okay. And so you're firing from like a ship or something?
There are cannons mounted on the ships. They're owned by the Navy, so I've never operated with those guns. The Army field artillery howitzers and cannons, they're mounted on tracks or on wheeled vehicles, and can traverse the land. And then it gets all set up, and then you might have several of them that you try to fire such that the rounds are hitting simultaneously to achieve greater impact.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. So if your job is to shoot from really far away, I don't see. I guess there is going to be some lack of empathy almost built into that technology, right? Because you don't see those people's faces. They are literally. Oh, well, I don't know. Are they literally dots on the screen?
Yeah. They are literally dots on the screen, and so all that to say that it becomes that much easier to enter into at least a bland dehumanization, right? I mean, because you don't have the face-to-face interaction, but it doesn't make it necessarily the case that therefore you do dehumanize, right? In fact, it becomes the responsibility of the various leaders involved, maybe, to very much keep those enemy humanized in the eyes of him or herself and her team, right? In order to help ensure we're properly wielding the deadly force that we are. The other danger, by the way, of this distance eroding empathy or preventing empathy from maybe properly happening, can also occur on the part of, and this is another role that I've played in the Army, would be a military planner, where I'm not in the thick of the fight. I'm back at some general's headquarters, And in fact, I might be like, in some second basement and it's windowless and there's like, very little interaction with the local populace, let alone enemy combatants. That just becomes another prime moment where being unempathetic can become too easy. This, in fact, was my own entrance into the empathy world. I was at a school the Army has for planners. And it was there that as we were reviewing doctrine, I was surprised to discover it there. And it grew into this entire project that I employed for that school's kind of master's thesis that I had to write. That was the initial genesis of all this. And by the way, so much of that, the reason I hung on to it was that by that point, I'd been to Iraq twice. First time in a field artillery unit, so doing field artillery stuff. And the second time as an advisor to Iraqi security forces. And so far less kind of battlefield contact and far more interacting with Iraqi counterparts and military planners and all that. So my initial motivation was that I thought empathy captured so much of what went wrong in Iraq and what went wrong in Afghanistan. Was there were any number of efforts that we were putting forth to maybe genuinely try to drum up a new and functioning democratic form of government that could benefit the people. I mean, the overall intention there was really present for, I think, a lot of soldiers. It's easy to think that because of some of the war crimes that occur, that everyone had that same mindset. It's just not the case. At the same time, if there'd been far more attempts at empathetically grasping the local Iraqis or the local Afghans and understanding their experience a lot more, I think it could have prevented the waste of effort, money, blood, and treasure that in the end, across the last 2 decades, has been difficult to watch.
Can you give an example of like how you think it would have gone differently and better if more people were empathetic?
Yeah. So there's one book written by a former State Department leader who was deployed to lead a provincial reconstruction team, which was the name for these State Department teams that were bolstered by some of us in the military. And the State Department folks are the ones thought to be the better experts at how you improve governance, how you improve the economy, how you improve the local kind of social status of a community. And yet in this book, he recounts a number of instances, and one in particular that comes to mind in answer to your question is there was this mandate of, hey, we need to increase and improve the economic viability of women in Iraq. And as part of this, right, there was all this funding to set up certain plants or factories where women could work, and it was insisted upon, despite this local State Department leaders expressed concerns of like, hey, that's not going to get received in the way that you're thinking. But there was just this insistence on projecting what would make a lot of sense to us as an American on the ground if we were receiving this help. And projecting that onto the local Iraqis with a real ignorance of the local cultural norms, the local history, and any number of other human factors that if there'd been a genuine attempt at empathy, all that would have been made perfectly clear. And the unrealistic objective of trying to insist on this kind of economic effort would have become more clear.
Okay, interesting. Okay. So I'm curious to know that, given your interest in empathy and the importance that you believe it has, how do you are there certain ways that the military gets portrayed in the media and in Hollywood that just bugs you?
Yeah. Honestly, Jason, I have a hard time watching military movies. All too often, I feel like they go to one extreme or the other. They either portray the U.S. military as diehard fanatics, just killing machines and with no moral compass whatsoever, which is not true, or the other way, right? It portrays them as having an incredible moral compass, but there's just no way to go, and they're just torn up and emotionally shredded, and there's just no either nobility to service in uniform or no way of navigating, which is also by and large not true. Sure, there are killing machines in uniform, and they need to be, tamped out and prevented from doing their bad business. And there are soldiers who do get emotionally shredded, and they need to be cared for. But it just ignores maybe the most common reality for most of us in uniform is somewhere in between those extremes. So yeah, I do get concerned sometimes by the portrayals. There's probably a few, if I thought long and hard about it enough, that I feel like do a more balanced job about it. But
What about something like Saving Private Ryan?
yeah, it definitely does a nice job of portraying the humanity of soldiers on both sides, to the extent that, I mean, I'm rusty from watching it, but um, it can be emotionally gripping. There's a point where I think it's actually a, almost a bit sensationalist in its own way. I have a colleague here, Elizabeth Samet, who actually published a book last year called "Looking for the Good War," and it's this critique of how so much of America's imagination looks back on World War II as this kind of idyllic moment of war that had no bad repercussions, or there was no debate within this own country of needing to participate. But of course, the history is so very different than that. And it was still a war, right? And so the word "good," anytime you put that in front of war, probably deserves to keep the scare quotes that used to be the norm in our if you look at that, she recounts and shows how any of the headlines in the 40s and 50s, right, a good war was kind of said in the quotation like manner. And then somewhere along the way, right, the quotations got dropped, and it was just kind of embraced as this good war with no tragic nature to it at all. And that's a dangerous thing. It can actually make us maybe too quick to consider war as an option with certain problems.
Sometimes when I watch art like war movies and stuff like that, there'll be this thing where the soldiers will have like ticks for how many people that they've killed. Like maybe
Yeah,
they have it
yeah,
marked under their plane or something like that. Or maybe
yeah.
like a sniper will keep track of it somehow, like maybe
Right,
tattoos or
right.
something like that.
Yeah.
Is that a real thing?
It has been. Yes, absolutely. I had a cadet for a student, in fact, who was fresh off of the summer training, where here at West Point we have these training areas out in the surrounding mountains. The Army will designate a unit from somewhere else to come to West Point and train the cadets for a portion of the summer. And in that training, this one cadet reports to one station, and a soldier who was manning that station at one point pulled out this walking stick, and on the walking stick it had these notches, and he was explaining to these cadets how he couldn't wait to get back to Iraq and add some notches to his walking stick. It was bothersome, and maybe in a way, to this cadet's credit, right? It bothered him enough that he brought it up in my philosophy class at one point, and it led to maybe a nice conversation about, hey, part of what these cadets are asked to do when they graduate and step into their roles as officers is, in fact, to prevent those kinds of attitudes from being the ones that are prominent, and gear the soldiers across their unit to a better way of looking at their jobs. So it is certainly a real problem. And let's think empathetically for a minute about that soldier that I've just been describing. I think we ought to chalk up him putting those notches on the stick as immoral, plain and simple. Yet at the same time, perhaps understandable, in that soldiers get very little preparation for the moral aspects of war. This is actually an argument I make in my book, in that we do soldiers a disservice in not orienting them far more fully than we do about all the moral underpinnings of what they're doing. And so, left to the soldier's own devices, it's the way he figured out to make sense of what he's doing. I guess I'm speaking as him, I guess I just have to embrace this killing thing, is it's not the bad thing that, maybe is our natural reaction to this. And in fact, it's what I'm paid to do. And see, this is where I spent a long time on this in chapter 3 of the purpose soldiers exist is not to kill. I think that kind of killing intention is actually mistaken. The purpose we're serving, the overarching, telos, if you'll allow me to bring in that ancient Greek term, is enabling a just and lasting peace. In establishing that peace, if killing has to happen along the way, and sometimes in the end, my military profession is based on the assumption that it does have to happen sometimes, then fine, it has to happen and be done well, competently. But along the way, we shouldn't embrace it wholeheartedly. It'd be kind of like a surgeon who is all too excited to do surgery in and of itself, as if it had intrinsic value. instead of treating surgery as merely having instrumental value, contributing hopefully to the health of the patient. To me, it's the same thing with soldiers, where we ought to be good at what we do, but only in the idea of the instrumental value it has to contribute to something higher and better, not the way this soldier was kind of embracing it as if it had intrinsic value in itself.
No, thank you for that. Do you think that there were different mindsets and attitudes depending on what part of the military you're in? Like I don't know much about the different branches and stuff like that. It's very complicated for me. But if I hear, like SEAL Team 6, like if there's just this reputation and maybe like this idea connected to them that they're super deadly, right? Like if you send them in, like they will get the job done, they will kill the target, whatever, and maybe they have a different mindset or something than somebody who isn't part of that team. I don't know.
Yeah. I think this killing intention, or like that is all that we do and the only reason we exist. I think it can vary as a problem across these different elements of the military as you're talking about. And in the special operations side, I've had a number of touch points with special operators and with others who are on the faculty who used to be part of those teams and are now, here teaching cadets. That it's actually been a problem that there's kind of this too wholehearted of an embrace of the killing that we do. And there's been special operations commanders, senior ones, who have been for the last several years trying to work on a balancing out of, yes, the killing that we need to be good at, but with the kind of way in which we do it, the restraint with which we show it, and the attitude we are to have towards it. There's been what would it be, an ethical lapse or omission that's been identified, and there's been lots of ways that they're trying to chip away at it. Partly because, firstly, because it's so vital to the proper conduct of their soldiers, but then secondly, it's out of protection for those soldiers, because it's precisely within some of those special operations circles that you see some of the starkest forms of moral injury, that thing I mentioned earlier, where after the fact, when they're no longer all pumped up and just doing what they've been trained to do, very second nature, but now they're reflecting on it and stuff and thinking about some of the excesses that they might have gone to, or even if it wasn't excessive, but somehow legally within the rights for them to do, they still secretly know that even if I had the legal ability to do so, I kind of didn't have to. And some of them are just crushed by it, that they no longer see what they're doing as a noble endeavor. And in fact, they see themselves as a version of the evil that they thought they were fighting. This moral injury more and more is getting pointed to as perhaps the single biggest factor in the very high suicide rate that you have among military veterans as compared to the general population. It's about 2 or 3 times as bad. And moral injury is being looked at as maybe what's driving soldiers to take their own lives. So a lot of these senior leaders are trying to get after this stuff, both for the conduct that they would prefer to see out on the battlefield and for the welfare of the soldiers that are under their command.
Okay, that makes sense. Do you think that war makes a soldier less empathetic?
It can. I don't think it has to. There's all sorts of important ways a commander needs to manage the emotional side of their soldiers as much as the physical side. And so in that, there needs to be proper breaks when at all possible. Like in my first year in Iraq, after the first few months on the ground, there was this recognition from on high, like, oh, the decision was made that we're going to stay longer than just a few months. And there was pretty quickly instituted a kind of rotation of soldiers from the patrols to a few days break. We started instituting 2-week leave periods where they would return to the United States and decompress before coming back. So there are ways, I think, to manage the erosion that I think is a very real possibility. So war can, but again, if you have the resources, both in terms of number of people and transportation ability and all these other logistical requirements, there's ways of preventing or at least mitigating the erosion that's very much possible. There's a point too where I think a proper empathetic understanding can actually bolster one's ability to navigate the difficulties of war. Jonathan Shea is a prominent psychologist who's oftentimes credited with coining the term moral injury. And he did a lot of his work with Vietnam veterans. And the ones who struggled the most, he found, were the ones who, in fact, had dehumanized the enemy, and in doing so, they robbed whatever kind of military service they were doing of any kind of nobility, right? Like they were haunted by the fact that they'd done these things to individuals that they had treated as less than human, but of course secretly knew were human. And a lot of times the therapy he would introduce would require them thinking through and talking as if they could talk to that enemy as a human. And closure wasn't coming until these individuals kind of granted the enemy their human status and working through it at that point. Notice how empathy becomes maybe a key element of even being able to do that. Even for some of his Vietnam veterans, grasping what might have been motivating their enemies to fight the way that they were and to be fighting at all. That actually led to closure in a way that was surprising for some, because if you think of them less than human, maybe it's easy to think, well, you just continue to think of them as a bug, and then it's inconsequential to you. But it's just totally proved not the case.
Okay, so that was going to be my next question, which is like, is there a concern that having more empathy actually leads to more moral injury?
Yeah, that's precisely maybe the big motivation for my final chapter in the book is okay, so fine, even if you're willing to grant me maybe some of the benefits empathy can bring to the endeavor, is it not making them more vulnerable to moral injury? In the end, I concede in this one way that yes, empathy maybe does allow moral injury to occur. It could serve as a conduit for it. But I'm quick to point out that it serves as a conduit the way that our eyes maybe are the conduit for the sun's blinding glare, right? Like we don't blame our eyes when we get blinded by the sun. It's the way we've employed those eyes, or the way that we've ignored, in fact, maybe the danger the eyes are starting to give us when we get close to staring at the sun, and then we do, right? Yeah, we don't blame our sense in that moment, and to me, it's parallel with empathy. Empathy is not to be blamed for moral injury, even if it is the way in which we sense the losses on the other side, the overall tragedy of war, and how that comes to grip us and possibly debilitate us in the ways that moral injury does. And then further, I think empathy becomes pretty vital to the recovering from moral injury. In this way, like if I'm a morally injured soldier, let's just say I'm just so grief stricken over stuff I've done and I can't make sense of it except to conclude that I just must be evil. Notice how it's an empathetic grasp of others and their view of me that might save me from becoming too convinced of that. It might be through empathetically understanding some other's view of me. Oh, they're not seeing me as evil incarnate in the way that I'm getting concerned about. It at least can be a lifeline of maybe there's another way to view what I've done. And so this is why a lot of the psychologists and other caregivers who have been working with military veterans, they underscore just how important a supportive group can be. This is also why it can be so hard for military veterans, is that you return from a deployment, and especially if you're in the reserves of the National Guard, they have it harder because they're not returning to a big old army post with lots of others who've just been at the same place. They might be returning to a tiny hometown wherever, and there is no one maybe who can truly empathize with where that soldier's been. And so the isolation can be its own danger in letting the moral injury get worse. But did I answer your question? I want to say empathy can be the conduit, but I'm quick to defend empathy as not maybe to blame for it.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to ask another basic question there, because you made another reference I don't really get. When you said like a person who's working for the National Guard or the Army Reserve, like what does that mean? What do you mean, like they go back to a small town instead of like a big base or something?
Yeah. So all the military services, Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, they have an active component, which would be like what I've been for the last 27 years, where I've been on active duty. And that means day in, day out, my job is to report to a unit and conduct Army business, Army training, whatever is needed to be ready to go deploy somewhere. So you got the active component, but then you've got two other components. So I'll just talk Army, but it's parallel for the others. The Army also has a reserve component. And this would be the individuals you've heard about who might only go and train once a month. And then every summer, there's actually a 2-week period where they will go and train for 2 weeks with their unit. They're called a reserve unit. So they would not be the first to get deployed anywhere, But if the war that is going on is perceived as large enough, there would be this activating of the Army Reserve units to be ready to deploy and bolster what we've already sent from the active component. So that's Army Reserves. And then this third element I mentioned, the National Guard element, they're similar to the reserves in that they might train once a month and then have a 2-week period in the summer where they also come together and train more fully. But the National Guard elements, they're organized across all the 50 states and answer first to the governor of that state. And so if you hear of a wildfires going on, and you might read about how they've activated National Guard to go and help with it, or some kind of significant amount of protesting or turmoil going on, these governors have the ability to bring the National Guard to help bolster maybe the local police or the other law enforcement individuals. So the National Guard, though, can also be activated in the way I mentioned the reserves can. They're just like the third layer that's drawn upon. The active component's drawn on first, Army Reserve second, National Guard third.
Okay, and you're saying that if they were to go to war and then come back, they're not with their peers or something?
Yeah, because these Reserve and National Guard units, they'll often be spread out across an entire state or multiple states. Like if I were in the reserves, I might live in New York, and yet the reserve unit I'm part of is in the next state over in Connecticut, and I go out there maybe once a month, 4 hours drive away, and I train for the weekend with my unit, and then maybe we deploy to Iraq. But after we come back, here I am back in New York. And just some of those battle buddies, right, that I spent the year with, they're just not in the immediate accessible area where I'm living.
Okay, but if you're on active duty and then you come back from war, you live near a base or something, and
right.
Okay.
And I continue on my daily work. I continue to meet with those others on that base as we now go about maybe repairing our equipment or getting ready for whatever's next. And it's just so us on active duty in all sorts of ways have it easier than these folks I'm talking about in the Reserves and National Guard. At least in this way, they can so easily be away from others who have shared experiences.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. All right, another question. What kind of changes would you like to see in the military?
Yeah, so specific to this moral preparation, I'd love to see some more formal time and effort devoted to here's this thing called just war theory, which is this ancient kind of tradition, if you will, dating all the way back to at least to Cicero, right? If you really want to go back to some ancient thinkers, certainly prominently carved out more fully under the efforts of Augustine, and then this other Christian thinker, Aquinas, and then a number of folks afterwards as well. But I guess what I'd like to see is I'd love to have more of our soldiers introduced to any number of these ways of making moral sense of war, both when it's morally justified to initiate a war and the kind of moral principles that has been figured out about what morally justifies some of the conduct within war, and then also what conduct it doesn't justify and why. And this would be key to answering your question. I want soldiers to be given the opportunity to grasp why, not just what they need to do, because that actually is already happening. We have lots of rules of engagement and briefs from our military lawyers about the lines you cannot cross. And your immediate supervisors, have enough experience that they'll often be able to make judgments that are right about what needs to happen. But nowhere in there are soldiers maybe equipped with grasping why that's right or what the rationale is for it. And yet that's precisely what they need in reflection. Because in reflection, after the fact of something they've done, that might be an appropriate action on a battlefield. So I'm not just talking war crimes. I'm talking, something that is been determined to be justified and responsible action. Those things can be hard for a soldier upon reflection to really tell herself why it is, or telling those others around her why what I did was okay. And so I'd love to see a bigger investment in soldiers grasping the why.
Okay, all right. That's interesting. Can you clarify that by just maybe using an example?
Yeah. So when I was deployed to Iraq in 2003 to 2004, my field artillery unit at one point was put in charge of a local community, and it entailed forming up our soldiers into a squad of 8 to 10 individuals that would do patrols. We received information that there was a fairly high level insurgent leader in this community, and it was solid enough intelligence that we coordinated a raid that we were going to do on this house to arrest the individual in the early morning. Upon the conduct of the raid, several of my soldiers were involved in the kicking down of the door and then the entering of the house. And in the immediate scan of the initial room, there was an individual who was hunched over and kind of like lunging at them. And in that lunging, right, like the soldiers could not figure out what he might be holding or what he was lunging at them with. And so two of those soldiers fired their weapons at the individual, who fell over, was incapacitated. The soldiers quickly kind of cleared the rest of the house. They ran across what looked to be like a mother and daughter and brought them to the front room. And then they immediately started rendering first aid to this individual that they had shot. And the individual died in front of them. And one of the soldiers in particular was really, really troubled that there was nothing in the individual's hands. Like he couldn't answer what the lunging was all about. For all he knew, the individual had tripped on the door jamb or something, right, and was accidentally just falling towards them. But in the moment, they made the best judgment they felt they could, and then and killed the individual. Well, to add on top of the confusion over that, this one soldier also had a daughter back at home, and a wife, and here he is kind of empathetically struggling, with now the loss that this daughter had of no longer having her father around, and the loss that the spouse now was going to suffer. And it was a week or two after this whole event that I, as commander, had some of the supervisors over him come and talk to me about how this one soldier was really struggling. The answer for some leaders in the Army can be stop the struggle. I need you out on patrol. Just turn that off and go, continue patrolling. I really didn't want to do that because in the end, the very empathy that this soldier was exercising in its own way can be vital to have. Sure, I can't have him so emotionally distraught that he's incapable of functioning. But I wanted to avoid the other extreme of coping by just turning robotic and edging that much closer to being like a killing machine. I needed his judgment informed by empathy in order to be conducting himself in a way that I could trust on any future patrolling or future actions that we might have for the remainder of that deployment. So to me, this could be one example. So we talked. I guess I should wrap up the story. I mean, we talked a little bit. We talked through all the difficult details of what happened. Ultimately, I didn't go into a lecture of just war theory and all this stuff, but I did kind of quietly listen a lot and offer a little of some of these concepts under the moral conduct of war that lays out maybe how it is tragic, and war is a tragedy. And that's maybe the first and most fundamental element that we need to have grasped. And it improves our mindset when we step in and actually conduct it then. I hope this serves as an example to answer your question, like his struggle, but then his ability to navigate that struggle, I think could be informed by this kind of preparation of why we do the things we do.
Okay, yeah. So I guess I wasn't entirely sure what you meant by asking the why question. Like, do you mean like the big why question, which is why are we even here, right? And then the smaller questions is like, why are we doing this right now?
Yeah, ultimately, I kind of mean both. Because when humans enlist in the military, they don't cease being humans and become only soldiers. And so there's just an unavoidability, I think, to asking the big whys as well as maybe the more specific whys to the situation. This is a conversation I have with cadets in the classroom here at West Point. Is one, it's important for you to understand the why of the overall war, even if you're not a very big agent in those decisions, right? I mean, you're not participating in the decisions that our political leaders are making. But democracy that we are, especially, I think, and the fact that we remain citizens even as we don a uniform, it becomes important to exercise some kind of judgment at that high level. The same kind of judgment that any civilian citizen would be expected to be making about what their government is doing. Now, for those of us in uniform, I do think that there is a formal deference that we take on as part of the profession, but it's not an utterly blind or ignorant deference. If there were a war being declared by our political leaders that was of extreme enough nature and a bald-faced lie, if it's even possible to have one, then there might be a moral mandate that I resist that war, the orders to go somewhere. But the difficult reality is that, political leaders always couch their justifications for a war in precisely these terms that I've been talking about. Now, there's still some responsibility to gauge how reliable might it be and all that. But then there's also a point where I think we're obligated morally to defer. And now this is where it can get quite philosophical if we talk about collective action versus individual action and the kind of delineation of duties that are part of collective action. I take this up a little bit in my last chapter, in fact, trying to be honest in navigating through it. But here too, right? I think from your lowest ranking soldier up to your highest generals, right? I mean, there's got to be some sense of the why you might be going and doing the things you're doing. And even if you might privately disagree with a judgment call that's been made by some of those on high, unless that judgment call, again, is way, way extreme, there's a point where what we've agreed to do in the military is to defer and to go ahead and then not defer the actual conduct of the action that's been decided, make sure that goes really well, morally, tactically, in that kind of way. But I do think soldiers need some introduction to the biggest of the why questions, because it's precisely those topics and those principles that are appealed to by the political leaders of, hey, this is what's worth the possible loss of your life. Or what really, if you think about it, might even be more controversial is these are the principles that are supposedly worth you taking others' lives for. I think it's the only way to be a responsible moral agent in uniform is if you wrestle with those things and come to grips with them and not do what might be more common, which is just utterly deferring any thought of that stuff. Especially for the future officers that I'm educating here at West Point. The officer corps in particular is looked at for this moral guidance and moral judgment. So they've got the least room to maybe try to avoid it. Maybe enlisted soldiers have some more room because their deference is greater to these specific officers. I think the deference also diminishes the higher up the chain you go. I mean, your highest 4-star general who's participating in those political leaders' private deliberations on whether to do a war or not, they've maybe got the least ability to blindly defer, even if they are still in uniform and still at some point responsible to defer. And this is why you see it's interesting for me from the inside to be watching a number of their generals, both active and retired, and the choices they make on how politically active to get or not. But this might be a whole nother topic, so I don't want to drift too far.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. So I have some Sun Tzu quotes, and I thought it would be interesting to get your commentary on these quotes.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So here is the first one. The art of war is governed by 5 constant factors to be taken into account in one's deliberations when seeking to determine the conditions obtaining in the field. These are 1, the moral law, 2, heaven, 3, earth, 4, the commander, 5, method and discipline. The moral law causes the people to be in complete accord with their ruler so that they will follow him regardless of their lives, undismayed by any danger.
Heck of a lot in the quote. This reference to the moral law, in some regards, I think dovetails real nicely with what we've just been talking about. I think what Sun Tzu is pointing out is that your subordinates are going to be more likely to be loyal and to submit their own lives to a certain cause that you're trying to rally them around, to the extent that they too can see how that cause is morally worth it and is somehow worth such sacrifice. And so it's precisely that moral law that I'm suggesting maybe we could do better at introducing the soldiers to. Now the other one, so like the second one was heaven in the quote. I
We
got to
don't
admit,
have to go to the other ones. I mainly wanted
yeah,
to get
yeah,
your perspective on that first one, and I thought
yeah,
it
yeah,
was
fair enough,
a
fair enough.
good continuation of the last comment that you made.
Right, 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 right,
So
right.
you have to read. Does everybody have to read The Art of War in the military?
It's not required in my class. There are excerpts that are required in certain classes, but I actually would hesitate. I don't think every cadet is reading the entire Art of War book. We do have a couple majors that you can choose where I'd be willing to bet they do read the whole thing. We have one major called Defense and Strategic Studies, and it's very much into military theory and grand strategy. And I'll almost guarantee they read it extensively. But outside of that major, I think the only one that every cadet is getting exposed to would be more at the level of excerpts and passages, and not the whole thing.
All right, I was just curious because I skimmed through the book again just to find interesting quotes and stuff, and like Sun Tzu just goes into great detail about like tactics and stuff like that, and like some of the words they're just like really old, right? It's like he's just writing thousands
Yeah,
of years ago, and it's just I'm not sure how much of it actually applies today, especially when it comes to tactics stuff. You know, like it's very detailed. I think he even talks about like this smoke or something in the air, and then you can kind of tell what the enemy is doing depending on how the dust is dispersing. Like if it's
right,
going this
right.
way, they have chariots, and it's like okay, well, I'm it's not going to be relevant today.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, maybe the example of being that precise in your observations, right, could be transferred, but certainly some of the details not going to transfer.
All right, let's look at another one. All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near.
Deception is key, and I see the statement as capturing a general rule of thumb that sure is important. But I got to admit, there's maybe sometimes where you want your enemy knowing how strong you are, if in fact you're seeing it as a moment of deterrence, right? Of somehow deterring them from doing something. That just strikes me as maybe one of the few exceptions to this general rule of, yeah, sure, the enemy not knowing these things about you is tactically very helpful. And then in these rare moments, maybe it's not. Maybe in fact, it might be important to somehow let the presence of your large army be its own communicating moment.
No, that makes sense. I can also see a connection to the empathy stuff mentioned earlier, right? Because the more you understand your enemy, the more that you can deceive them.
Potentially, right, right. You'll be that much more accurate, perhaps, in grasping what will deceive them, right, and where they can be deceived. Yeah, 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 yeah. And notice, do you hear the kind of weird tone to empathy at that point? Like, I think our common cultural use of empathy, it's got embedded in it a kind of very moral sense to it or something. But the more I studied it, the more I kind of separated it maybe from that inherently moral piece. If anything, I think it still contributes to morality in important ways. But empathy by and by itself might be amoral or might not have inherently moral component to it.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of Kant, right? And him saying that the only thing good without qualification is the goodwill.
Right. Everything
Everything
else
else could
is
be used badly and for evil means.
right, right, right. That would be exactly in line with this idea that you may not want your villain to be empathetic because it'd make him that much more of an effective villain.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, let's look at another one. Oh, this is a good one. There is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare.
Yeah. Again, deeply true, right, by and large, and certainly a timely commentary, perhaps. Uh, my only slight resistance to it might be in how we define prolonged. I mean, the American Revolution was at least 6 years, but then it depends on how you cash out some of the unrest prior to 1776 and stuff. And if you define prolonged as something beyond 4 years, let's say, because World War II is technically like 7 years from like 38 to 45. So yeah, I mean, depending on how you define prolonged, maybe there's some exceptions to this, and then also depending on how you define benefit. Um, this is the concern with maybe a utilitarian or consequentialist approach, right? Of in the short term, maybe some war has been extremely costly, but lo and behold, it is precisely what led to some kind of important historical arc that we want to embrace is really good. So in this regard, I don't know whether it's fair to count where Japan is now versus where it was in 1938, or where Germany was in 1938 versus where it is now. These are benefits that maybe were certainly unknown in 1945, but we're certainly appreciative of now. But yeah, look, in the end, what I like about the quote is maybe it's a very sobering reminder of how war needs to be our last resort. And we need to be very sincere and authentic in our attempts at other things besides war. Diplomacy, I think, is something that gets dismissed all too quickly in the imaginations of some.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds good. So when I read that quote, I was like, whoa, like that, like the way that is saying it, like he is saying, like, look, this is almost like a law of human nature, and
Yeah,
the I don't know, I just imagine somebody with a lot of military experience, like writing this stuff down. I'm like, I'm telling all of you what this truth that I have discovered through all the years of warfare that I've conducted, you
mm,
know? And I
yeah,
just think it's interesting how some statement like that made thousands of years ago can still be true. Because then it just kind of, he is almost talking about human nature.
yeah, yeah. And I guess in a way it's sad, right? Because if we had enough humility or something and attentiveness, maybe we could glean what we need to glean from these incredibly important statements being made by our predecessors. And yet, maybe this is another element of human nature, right? We all too often need to prove it ourselves than maybe take the wisdom that has already been proven or already been painfully gained. Yeah,
Absolutely. And I don't know historically what the wars looked like back then, but how long were their wars? Like
yeah,
I
right,
don't know. And what would Sun Tzu think about the wars that we fought? Like, would he be like,
right,
"Oh my God, you guys are nuts"?
right, right. Yeah, might be.
Yeah. All right, let's take a look at another one. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle.
So true, so true. In my own assignments where I've been a planner and stuff, right? I mean, I've both listened to generals talk about this and kind of observed it or witnessed it myself too, right? That we can be blind to something about ourselves and it fouls up maybe plans we make or assumptions we make, or blind to something about the enemy and contributes in the exact same way to poor planning and even poor execution. And and empathy perhaps I think most plainly connects with this quote out of the ones so far. It's a nice moment though to underscore empathy's understanding not only that it gives us of an enemy that we've talked about at length, but I think empathy also has this really important contribution to make to self-knowledge, because it's through empathetically grasping others that in fact you can come to a greater understanding of yourself. And that's almost a direct quote from Edith Stein, who did her dissertation work on empathy. But the best leaders, this is one other reason it's in our leadership doctrine, is that the best leaders can empathetically look at themselves through the eyes of their subordinates. And maybe in that regard, come to a truer sense of what they're doing and how they're coming across versus, an utterly internal conclusion about how they must be coming across. Yeah, empathy's got this massive contribution to make to how we perceive ourselves.
Yeah. All
And so
right.
I love that in that quote too.
That sounds great. I think I do want to wrap this up. Are you do you want to share the projects that you're currently working on, or any like future projects?
Only in the briefest of ways, I guess I'll mention that we get concerned about the militarization of law enforcement or of business. I've seen an extended argument concerned about the militarization of education, even. And I guess all I want to say is that there's a point as I was studying some of this that in my own mind I came to get concerned about: are we militarizing the military? Right? Like, is there a way in which some of those excesses that we're worried about in these other social constructs actually might be a way of describing the excess I'm concerned about within the military? So in this regard, I see it as an extension maybe of my empathy work, where I see empathy as something that's neglected. Maybe it's getting neglected because we've got this overly militarized sense of the military. But we got to flesh out what I mean by that.
Okay, well, that sounds good. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This conversation has been so interesting.
Thanks, Jason. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it, especially exploring it in this dialogue fashion. Right? It's so much more lively.
Absolutely. All right. Well,
Yeah.
take care. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jason. Bye bye.